If successful, society will remain largely intact and will be able to begin a slow and painful process of cultural transformation and eventually develop a new economy, a gradually deindustrializing economy at a much lower level of resource expenditure, characterized by quite a lot of austerity and even poverty, but in conditions that are safe, decent, and dignified. If unsuccessful, society will be gradually destroyed in a series of convulsions that will leave a defunct nation composed of many wretched little fiefdoms. Given its largely depleted resource base, a dysfunctional collapsing infrastructure, and its history of unresolved social conflicts, the territory of the former United States will undergo a process of steady degeneration punctuated by natural and man-made cataclysms. Food, shelter, transportation, security. When it comes to supplying these survival necessities, the Soviet example offers many valuable lessons. As I already mentioned, in a collapse, many economic negatives become positives and vice versa. Let us consider each one of these in turn. The Soviet agricultural sector was plagued by consistent underperformance. In many ways, this was the legacy of the disastrous collectivization experiment carried out in the 1930s, which destroyed many of the more prosperous farming households and herded people into collective farms. Collectivization undermined the ancient village-based agricultural traditions that had made pre-revolutionary Russia a well-fed place that was also the breadbasket of Western Europe. A great deal of further damage was caused by the introduction of industrial agriculture. The heavy farm machinery alternately compacted and tore up the topsoil while dosing it with chemicals, depleting it, and killing the biota. Eventually, the Soviet government had to turn to importing grain from countries hostile to its interests, United States and Canada, and eventually expanded this to include other foodstuffs. The URSS experienced a permanent shortage of meat and other high-protein foods, and much of the imported grain was used to raise livestock to try to address this problem. Although it was generally possible to survive on the foods available at the government stores, the resulting diet would have been rather poor, and so people tried to supplement it with food they gathered, raised, or caught, or purchased at farmers' markets. Kitchen gardens were always common, and once the economy collapsed, a lot of families took to growing food in earnest. The kitchen gardens by themselves were never sufficient, but they made a huge difference. The year 1990 was particularly tough when it came to trying to score something edible. I remember one particular joke from that period. Black humor has always been one of Russia's main psychological coping mechanisms. A man walks into a food store, goes to the meat counter, and sees that it is completely empty. And so he asks the butcher, "Don't you have any fish?" And the butcher answers, "No, here's where we don't have any meat. Fish is what they don't have over at the seafood counter." Poor though it was, the Soviet distribution system never collapsed completely. In particular, the deliveries of bread continued even during the worst of times, partly because it has always been such an important part of the Russian diet, and partly because access to bread symbolized the pact between the people and the communist government, enshrined in oft-repeated revolutionary slogans. Also, it is important to remember that in Russia, most people have lived within walking distance of food shops and used public transportation to get out to their kitchen gardens, which were often located in the countryside immediately surrounding the relatively dense, compact cities. This combination of factors made for some lean times, but very little malnutrition and no starvation. In the United States, the agricultural system is heavily industrialized and relies on inputs such as diesel, chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and perhaps most importantly, financing. In the current financial climate, the farmer's access to financing is not at all assured. The agricultural system is efficient, but only if you regard fossil fuel energy as free. In fact, it is a way to transform fossil fuel energy into food with a bit of help from sunlight, to the tune of 10 calories of fossil fuel being embodied in every calorie that is consumed as food. The food distribution system makes heavy use of refrigerated diesel trucks, transporting food over hundreds of miles to resupply supermarkets. The food pipeline is long and thin, and it takes only a couple of days of interruptions for supermarket shelves to be stripped bare. Many people live in places that are not within walking distance of stores, not served by public transportation, and will be cut off from food sources once they're no longer able to drive. Besides the supermarket chains, much of the nation's nutrition needs are being met by an assortment of fast food joints and convenience stores. In fact, in many of the less fashionable parts of cities and towns, fast food and convenience store food is all that is available. In the near future, this trend is likely to extend even to the more prosperous parts of towns and suburbs. Fast food outfits such as McDonald's may have more ways to cut costs, and so may prove a bit more resilient in the face of economic collapse than supermarket chains, but they are no substitute for food security because they too depend on industrial agribusiness. Their food inputs, such as high fructose corn syrup, genetically modified potatoes, various soy-based fillers, factory-farmed beef, pork, and chicken, and so forth, are derived from oil, 2/3 of which is imported, as well as fertilizer made from natural gas. They may be able to stay in business longer, supplying food that isn't really food, but eventually they will run out of inputs along with the rest of the supply chain. Before they do, they may for a time sell burgers that aren't really burgers, like the bread that wasn't really bread that the Soviet government distributed in Leningrad during the Nazi blockade. It was mostly sawdust with a bit of rye flour added for flavor. Can we think of any ways to avoid this dismal scenario? The Russian example may give us a clue. Many Russian families could gauge how fast the economy was crashing and, based on that, decide how many rows of potatoes to plant. Could we perhaps do something similar? There is already a healthy gardening movement in the United States. Can it be scaled up? The trick is to make small patches of farmland available for non-mechanical cultivation by individuals and families, in increments as small as 1,000 feet. The ideal spots would be fertile bits of land with access to rivers and streams for irrigation. Provisions would have to be made for campsites and for transportation, allowing people to undertake seasonal migrations out to the land to grow food during the growing season and haul the produce back to the population centers after taking in the harvest. An even simpler approach has been successfully used in Cuba, converting urban parking lots and other empty bits of land to raised bed agriculture. Instead of continually trucking in vegetables and other food, it is much easier to truck in soil, compost, and mulch once a season. Raised highways can be closed to traffic, since there is unlikely to be much traffic in any case, and used to catch rainwater for irrigation. Rooftops and balconies can be used for hothouses, hen houses, and a variety of other agricultural uses. How difficult would this be to organize? Well, Cubans were actually helped by their government. But the Russians managed to do it more or less in spite of the Soviet bureaucrats, so we might be able to do it in spite of the American ones. The government could theoretically head up such an effort, purely hypothetically speaking, of course, because I see no evidence that such an effort is being considered. For our fearless national leaders, such initiatives are too low level. If they stimulate the economy and get the banks lending again, the potatoes will simply grow themselves. All they need to do is print some more money, right? Moving on to shelter. Again, let's look at how the Russians managed to muddle through. In the Soviet Union, people did not own their place of residence. Everyone was assigned a place to live, which was recorded in a person's internal passport. People could not be dislodged from their place of residence for as long as they drew oxygen. Since most people in Russia live in cities, the place of residence was usually an apartment or a room in a communal apartment with a shared bathroom and kitchen. There was a permanent housing shortage, and so people often doubled up with 3 generations living together. The apartments were often crowded, sometimes bordering on squalid. If people wanted to move, they had to find somebody else who wanted to move, who would want to exchange rooms or apartments with them. There were always long waiting lists for apartments, and children often grew up, got married, and had children before receiving a place of their own. These all seem like negatives, but consider the flip side of all this. The high population density made this living arrangement quite affordable. With several generations living together, families were on hand to help each other. Grandparents provided daycare, freeing up their children's time to do other things. The apartment buildings were always built near public transportation, so they did not have to rely on private cars to get around. Apartment buildings are relatively cheap to heat, and municipal services are easy to provide and maintain because of the short runs of pipe and cable.